Hi, I'm Paul Humphrey, and I'm assistant professor at Colgate University, where I teach classes in LGBTQ studies and Caribbean studies. My presentation today is called Drawing the Line, Decolonizing Borders and Hurricane María in Puerto Rican Comics. In her book chapter on Why Disaster from Why Comics, Hilary Shute points to the numerous ways that graphic narratives serve as a site of activism and resistance, not least in periods of great personal, political, and societal suffering. The juxtaposition of image and, most often, text evokes a particular form of engagement with the notions of memory, community, personal and/or marginalized narratives, and historiography. This implicates the reader in the particular forms of knowledge creation that the comics creators engage in through their work in ways that differ from other forms of cultural production. In this short presentation, I will focus on two key ideas in comics depicting Hurricane María and its aftermath. One, the problematic relationship with physical and conceptual borders, and two, the ongoing conflicts between extractivist policies and Puerto Rican-centered sustainable futures. These can be seen in anthologies such as Puerto Rico Strong and Ricanstruction, comics from independent publishers such as La Borinqueña or Temporada, and PDF and webcomics such as Rosa Colón's numerous works accessible online. In her analysis of the anti-colonial queer womanist orientation to Rosa Colón's English-language webcomics, María Fernanda Díaz-Basteris observes that their virtual publication is a political act that situates the artists not as victims, but rather as surviving users of the virtual worldwide portal. In so doing, these webcomics generate a deep sense of belonging and invite an international audience into a process of anti-colonial empathy. This is the case for other publications of Colón's, such as María, distributed as a PDF. Here, the format, size and placement of panels, and positioning of text all reinforce the simultaneous themes of physical destruction and confinement, the perception of time and its deconstruction, and the ways in which external forces, both physical and political, penetrate the borders of the island in a destructive way. Following the gradual deterioration of the Puerto Rican flag with its red, white, and blue colors, the comic then ends with an image of unity and collaboration from within the nation's borders and the removal of the symbolic colonial colors from the flag. Moving beyond Rosa Colón's work, however, I want to extend Díaz-Basteris' commentary on the form and subject matter of Colón's digital comics to two titles that only appear in print. In Temporada, Rosaura Rodriguez also invokes the notion of time, titling her comic Season or Spell of Time, while also drawing on the word temporal, meaning a strong storm. In it, she depicts in watercolors scenes from daily life to examine the immediacy of the hurricane and its effects, but also the longer season that it is part of and that has not ended. The book juxtaposes everyday activities such as producing art and cutting her hair in a bid to save water with the direct effects of the colonial junta imposed on Puerto Rico under the guise of ensuring debt payment. In these three panels, Rodriguez paints a direct link between the closure of 283 schools in 2018, the subsequent renting of 200 metal containers to serve as classrooms and offices, to the smell coming from container trucks still being used as makeshift morgues for hundreds of bodies more than 9 months after the hurricane's landfall. The comic notes that those from outside will quantify the disaster in terms of deaths, but when we read this alongside the closing panel of the comic, depicting the quotidian normalcy of the yellow school bus traveling along the unrepaired road surrounded by leafless trees, we can perceive the political commentary that resonates throughout the comic. After all, in contrast with Colón's work, that shows the production of comics using technology and uses the virtual space as a mode of anti-colonial discourse. Here, the use of watercolors might suggest both a response to circumstances of not having power, but also a divestment from the omnipresence of technology in daily life and the politics surrounding the plans to privatize the electrical grid in Puerto Rico after its collapse during the hurricane. Indeed, she notes earlier that at least the hurricane got rid of Ricardo Rossello's signs, and that Caribbean ingenuity is life, rejecting the capitalist and neo-colonial projects of the former governor's response to the hurricane, such as courting energy-guzzling cryptocurrency miners to Puerto Rico, without the requisite power grid to serve the island's population. And this has been examined in Naomi Klein's The Battle for Paradise and also in a new documentary from Cecilia Aldarondo called Landfall. Like Colón, then, Rodríguez critiques here the extractivist policies that have governed politicians' recovery efforts, that is, the exportation of Puerto Ricans to the mainland US, while inviting a new wave of settler colonizers to privatize both the structures and the physical land of the island. This is a narrative that we see more explicitly undermined in Edgardo Miranda-Rodríguez's La Borinqueña. The clearest example of a decolonial framework across the two issues of the comic is one I have discussed previously, and that Enrique Garcia examines in his new book chapter on indigeneity in the text. As Garcia notes, Miranda-Rodríguez's close engagement with Taino spirituality alongside Afro-Puerto Rican religious influences sees La Borinqueña combat the ongoing colonial narrative in post-María Puerto Rico and present the possibility of a decolonial independent future. For the purposes of our discussion here, the important note is that La Borinqueña derives her superpowers from her Taino and Afro-Puerto Rican heritage, and mostly from the power accorded her by Atave, the Taino mother spirit, alongside Huracán, the wind, and Yugao, associated with the mountains and sea. She uses these powers to save those stranded during the hurricane or school children endangered by unrepaired roads, while exploring the often unspoken Taino history of the island. As we see here, like on the next slide, the comics use Taino representations of the spirits and natural world, with La Borinqueña as a young girl here sporting a coquille petroglyph on her clothing. La Borinqueña negotiates borders with relative ease, be they the indigenous and African-derived spiritualities on the island, the crossover between spiritual and scientific knowledge, or the difficulties of being a Nuyorican Afro-Boricua superhero who is still learning the history of Boriquen. Equally, in this post-María moment, she is able to bypass commercial air travel between New York and the island, and so symbolically demonstrate that the huge restrictions on people's movements are not quote-unquote natural, but rather the product of capitalism. However, while offering possibilities, the comic also outlines the key conflict between Boricua-centered and commercial US-oriented interests that has defined this post-María moment. At the issue's close, Dulcinea, a company that made its fortune from the sugar industry on the island, which is an issue that Colón has also examined. So Dulcinea moves to extract and monetize the source of Puerto Rico's recovery. Hijacking the student-led protest against Dulcinea's reach, white mercenaries capture the star from which La Borinqueña draws her power. That is, the symbol which combines the power of the spirits, natural elements and ancestors of the island. Echoing Colón and Rodríguez, the way they capture this source sees the superhero, who embodies the essence of Boriquen, incarcerated inside the star through electrocution, using that same resource that Rosselló sought to privatize and that had not been restored to the whole island by the time the issue was published. For each of these artists, then, the hurricane response is just another example of the colonial and extractivist policies of the United States being implemented on the island, yet one that can be rectified by a Boricua-centered, decolonial narrative that rejects colonial ways of being and knowing to focus on collective action and Puerto Rican stewardship of the island. Thank you.